Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you a simple crochet stitch that looks like knitting. So, in my personal opinion, there are a lot of types of crochet techniques that are kind of just made for the purpose of making the crochet look like knitting. A lot of people would like their crochet to look like knitting, but it's not knitting, it's crochet. So that is never totally 100% possible. There will never be a crochet stitch that looks exactly like knitting. It will always be just a little bit different, even for the knit look stitches. But this one is very simple to work. Again, it is a knit look stitch, and it is not going to look exactly like knitting. If a knitter were to look at this fabric, at first glance, it might look knitted, but if somebody who knits a lot and understands the structure of knitting were to stop and look at this, they're going to be able to tell that it's not knitted. But as for everybody else who does not understand the structure of knitted fabric, this is going to look very, very similar to the knitted fabric. So I have a little swatch of this here, and this particular stitch, I usually call it the ribbed half double crochet in my pattern if I'm using it for a ribbing, but I have also heard it called half double crochet in the third loop. So that's not the front loop or the back loop, it's the third loop, which I will explain in a minute. But either way, it creates kind of a ridged or ribbed type of fabric. So the thing with this stitch that we have to remember is that when we work this stitch, to make it look like knitting, we have to turn the rows sideways. So if you are working something where the rows go back and forth across this way, that's the direction that your knitted columns are going to go. So for example, I would not, you could if you really wanted to, but I would not choose to use this stitch in like a sweater or something that is crocheted back and forth from the bottom up, because it's not going to look knitted. But if you want it to look knitted, then the rows need to go vertically, because that is what gives it that knit look. So this is very similar to a swatch of ordinary half double crochet, except for that we are not working into the top of the stitch as normal, we are working into the third loop. So if we look at these knit columns here, these look pretty similar to knit stitches. Of course they're not, and they're never going to look exactly like a knit stitch, but this is kind of the next best thing since we're not actually knitting. So we are getting these little columns of V-shaped stitches, and what that is that's actually the top edge of a regular half double crochet. But to be able to see both sides of the V shape along that top edge, we can't work into either the back loop or the front loop. We cannot work into those at all to get this look. So we're going to work into that third loop, which will kind of bend the top of the stitch forward a little bit, fold it forward so we can see both the back and front loop of the top of that stitch on the surface of the fabric. So to do this, I'm going to chain 2 and turn, and I am not counting my chain 2 as a stitch here. So you will need to keep that in mind. Whether you choose to count that turning chain as a stitch is up to you. But in this particular situation, which is just a demo, I am not counting it as a stitch. Now I have also used this same stitch pattern in my knit look hat, my knit look cowl, and even on the ribbings of my comfy cozy cardigan. So I have used this in patterns several times. If you want to go check out any of those, I'll put the links down in the description box below. But anyway, I'm not counting the turning chain as a stitch, so I'm going to work my first stitch into the very same stitch that my chains are coming from. So if we look at the top of our stitch here, here is the back loop, and here is the front loop. And if you are not familiar with that, I have a whole video on the back and front loop only, so you can go check that out if you're not familiar with the back loop and the front loop. But normally when we work a stitch, we would insert into both the back and the front loop. But in this case, we're not going to insert into either of those. So here's the back loop, here's the front loop. I am going to tip this forward so that I can see the front surface of the stitches. And I'm going to pick up this strand of yarn that kind of runs diagonally from one stitch to the next. And so when I insert into that stitch, both the front loop and the back loop of that other stitch, or the top of the stitch I should say, are not worked into, but they are folded forward. So this is what's facing us right now is the back of the previous row of half double crochet. Now you can work into the third loop of double crochet or treble crochet, but single crochet doesn't really have a third loop, so don't try to do this with single crochet. But it looks best if you're going for the knit look. It looks best if you're doing this in half double crochet. That's just my opinion, but I don't usually use this for double crochet or treble crochet. So as for a normal half double crochet, I'm going to yarn over. And then again, here is that very first stitch we're going to work into. We're going to ignore both loops of the top of the stitch and then come down here and pick up this diagonal strand. So that diagonal strand is what we call the third loop. Now I'm going to yarn over, pull up a loop, and yarn over, pull through 3 loops as normal. So we've just made a regular half double crochet, but we're working it into a different part of the stitch below. So now we can see that the top of that same stitch is still free. There's no stitches worked into it, and it kind of folds out. So again, I'm going to yarn over. I'm going to look at this next stitch, and instead of inserting into the top of the stitch, I'm going to ignore both loops at the top of that stitch and come down here and pick up the diagonal strand, which is the third loop, which runs across the stitch on what is facing me as the front. And then I'm going to work the rest of my half double crochet. So again, here's the next stitch. I'm not going to insert into the top of the stitch. I'm going to come down here and pick up that third loop and work the half double crochet there. So as you can see, this is not really that difficult to work because it is essentially just like regular half double crochet. All we're changing is where we are putting it. So as you can see, as I've started to work across my row, the tops of those stitches are kind of folded back a little bit so that they create that column of what looks kind of like a knit stitch. So that column is what is kind of giving us our knit look, and we want to continue doing that to create the whole fabric in that look. However, I have done this like in my Comfy Cozy Cardigan for only the first so many stitches of each row, because that cardigan is worked with vertical rows, and it creates just a ribbing like at the bottom and at the sleeve cuffs. So I am going to continue working my ribbed half double crochet or half double crochet in the third loop all the way across my row, and then I will show you what that looks like. Alright, so I've made it to the end of my row, and since I was not counting the chains, the turning chains, as a stitch, I am not going to work into that. So the last place I worked into was the third loop of the last half double crochet, and I'm totally ignoring the chains, the turning chains. So here's what my piece looks like so far. If we look at it horizontally, then it just looks like it's knitted sideways, but we want it to look like it is knitted going this direction, because this is usually the way that the knitting would go in a regular knitted piece. So we can see how that working into that third loop kind of folds the tops of the stitches back to create those knit columns. So like I said, if you are interested in using this stitch in a project, I have several projects that use this. 2 of them specifically use this stitch only for the entire thing. So go ahead and check out my Knit Look cowl and my Knit Look hat if you want to give this stitch a try. And I think this is a great stitch for any time you want a little bit of extra surface texture without a whole lot of complicated stitch pattern work. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know what is your favorite Knit Look crochet stitch in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.